Gary was 44 when he opened his banking app at his kitchen table and saw $312 sitting in savings. Not for a house, not for retirement. That was everything he had left after 22 years of full-time work. He called his brother that night, and the words came out like a confession. "I thought I had time," he said. He had no idea that saying it out loud was the first thing that would actually save him. So, tell me in the comments, how much did you have saved at 40? Gary wasn't lazy, and he wasn't careless with money in any obvious way. He paid his bills on time. He never carried a balance he couldn't cover. But every time his paycheck grew, his spending grew right along with it, quietly, without him ever noticing the pattern. A raise at work became a nicer truck payment. A bonus became a kitchen remodel his wife had wanted for years. None of it felt wrong in the moment. Each choice made sense on its own. It's only when you stack 20 years of those choices on top of each other that you get a man standing in his kitchen at 44 with $300 to his name and a stomach full of dread. Here's what makes Gary's story worth your next 15 minutes. He wasn't the one who taught himself the lesson that turned things around. That came from a coworker named Dennis, a maintenance supervisor 2 years older than Gary, who had started from almost the same place. Dennis hadn't inherited money. He hadn't gotten a sudden windfall or a lucky stock pick. What Dennis had done, starting at 45, was something so small it sounded almost insulting when Gary first heard about it. Dennis had automated $40 a week out of his checking account the day it landed before he ever saw the number in his balance. $40. Less than 2 tanks of gas. Gary laughed the first time Dennis told him about it in the break room. $40 a week wasn't going to fix anything, he thought. It wasn't going to undo 20 years of nothing. But Dennis wasn't finished talking, and what he said next is the reason this video exists at all. He told Gary that the $40 wasn't the point. The habit was the point. Once the habit existed, it got easier to raise the number, and once the number started climbing, something in Dennis's head shifted from "I can't do this" to "I'm already doing this." That shift is the part almost nobody talks about because it doesn't show up on a spreadsheet. It shows up in whether a person keeps going or quits after week 3. There's a reason this matters so much for anyone over 40 specifically. You've heard the compound interest talk before, probably from someone 25 years old telling you to start saving in your 20s, as if you can go back and do that. That advice is true, and it's also useless to you right now because you can't reach back in time and hand your younger self $100 a month. What you can do is something almost nobody explains clearly, and it has to do with how the last 15 years before retirement actually work, not the first 15 years of a career. Gary didn't know this yet, standing in his kitchen. He just knew he was scared, and he knew Dennis seemed a lot less scared than he was. If you're watching this and you already feel that same tightness Gary felt, stick around, because the next part is where his story actually turns, and it's the reason his brother stopped worrying about him within 18 months. And if any of this sounds familiar, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because the second half of this video covers the exact number that changed everything for Gary, and I don't want you to miss it. Dennis kept talking that day in the break room, and what he said next is the part Gary still repeats to people today. Dennis told him about something called a catch-up contribution. If you're 50 or older, the government actually lets you put more money into your retirement account each year than someone younger is allowed to, specifically because lawmakers know most people don't get serious about saving until later in life. Gary was 44 at the time, so he wasn't there yet, but Dennis was 46 and he was already using it. He was putting away more per year than most of his younger coworkers, at the exact moment in life when most people assume it's too late to matter. Gary sat with that for a long moment. Nobody had ever told him the rules were different once you crossed 50. He'd spent years assuming the game was already over for him. That single piece of information cracked something open in Gary that no amount of general advice ever had. It wasn't hope exactly. It was closer to permission. Permission to stop treating his age like a closed door and start treating it like a starting gun that had gone off a little later than he'd planned. He went home that night and did something he'd never done before. He sat down and actually looked at his spending line by line for a full month. Not to punish himself, just to see it clearly, the way you'd finally turn the lights on in a room you'd been avoiding. What he found surprised him. It wasn't one big expense wrecking everything. It was a pile of small ones that had crept in slowly over the years and never left. A streaming service he hadn't opened in months. A gym membership he used twice. Lunches out that had become a habit rather than a choice. None of it was dramatic on its own, and that's exactly why he'd never noticed it before. Dramatic problems get your attention. Quiet ones don't, and quiet is exactly how most people over 40 end up broke without ever making one obviously bad decision. Gary cut what he could and redirected it, following Dennis's model almost exactly. He automated the transfer so the money left his account before he could talk himself out of it. And he started with an amount that felt almost too small to matter, the same way Dennis had. $90 a week. That was it. No dramatic lifestyle overhaul, no cutting out everything he enjoyed, just one consistent, boring habit that ran quietly in the background of his life. Here's the number that changed how Gary thought about the next 20 years of his life. $90 a week, invested and left alone, comes out to roughly $470 a month. Over 15 years, with average market growth, that number turns into somewhere around $140,000. Gary was 44. That put him at 59, 1 year from his planned retirement age, with real money behind him instead of $312 and a knot in his stomach. He wasn't going to be wealthy. He wasn't going to be one of those stories where someone retires at 50 with a boat and a lake house. But he was going to have options, and at 44, standing in that kitchen, options were the one thing he thought he'd already lost. The part that still gets Gary, even now, is how close he came to never starting at all. He told me later that if Dennis hadn't happened to mention the catch-up rule that specific afternoon, he probably would have kept telling himself the same story he'd been telling himself for years. The one where it was already too late, so why bother? That story felt true. It felt reasonable. It was also completely wrong, and the only reason Gary knows that now is because someone finally said the actual numbers out loud instead of just the fear. You don't need Dennis's exact number or Gary's exact age for this to apply to you. What you need is the shift they both made. The one where you stop asking whether you have enough time to fix everything and start asking whether you have enough time to build something. Those are two different questions, and only one of them keeps you stuck. Gary is 52 now. His savings account doesn't look like everyone else's on paper, and it doesn't need to. What changed for him wasn't a windfall or a lucky break. It was one decision, made on an ordinary Tuesday, to stop letting his age be the excuse and start letting it be the reason he moved faster. He still remembers standing in that kitchen with $312 to his name, and he says the strangest part is how normal that moment felt at the time. No alarm bells, no dramatic low point, just a quiet number on a screen that could have stayed his whole story if he'd let it. That's the thing about starting late. It rarely announces itself as the big turning point while it's happening. It usually looks like an ordinary Tuesday, an automated transfer for less money than you'd spend on dinner out. A conversation in a break room you almost didn't pay attention to. Gary almost didn't. You get to decide right now whether you will. If you made it this far, you already have more information than Gary had standing in that kitchen. You know about the catch-up rule if you're 50 or older. You know the habit matters more than the starting number. What you don't know yet is the one mistake almost everyone over 40 makes right after they start saving again. The one that quietly undoes half the progress before they even notice it's happening. That's exactly what the next video walks you through, step by step, so it doesn't happen to you. Go watch it now, before it costs you the way it almost cost Gary.